Krystal and Saagar did an interview with Aaron Maté last week on The Hills Rising. And I have to say that Krystal and Aaron are some of my favorite people in new media, especially on the left. And Aaron Maté, who's for the last couple of years been covering the whole Russiagate nonsense, conspiracy theory that the president of the United States is somehow beholden to the Russian government and all that other nonsense. Aaron's done a great job of debunking Russiagate, Ukrainegate, and really exposing how wrong and untrustworthy a lot of the news media is. And even before Russiagate, Aaron Maté, I always liked his work. He had great criticisms of U.S. foreign policy and imperialism and corruption in the political system. So Aaron Maté and Krystal usually have some great insights on whatever it is they're talking about. But I watched this interview, and towards the end of the interview, they started discussing the part of John Bolton's new book where he basically says that Trump gave the green light to the Chinese president to do these concentration camps where they're kidnapping and torturing, as far as we know, at least 1 million innocent Uyghur Muslims in China, and bringing them to these, quote, re-education camps, which are literally concentration camps. So, but when this part of the interview comes up, Aaron Maté does this bizarre defense of the Chinese government, uses all kinds of flawed logic, and Krystal Ball provides no pushback. It was really disturbing to watch this part of the interview because it made me cringe to see Aaron Maté make any kind of defense of the Chinese government on this specific issue of their kidnapping and torturing over 1 million innocent Uyghur Muslims. So I have the clip. It's about 1 minute and 20 seconds long, and then I'll come back and I'll break it down.
Seemed to indicate that Trump had basically given the green light, like, go ahead and do the concentration camps for Uyghur Muslim minority. That's what you should be doing, I think, is essentially what the quote was. What did you make of those allegations?
Well, first of all, I'm careful. I don't actually adopt the term concentration camps because to me, that's a term that is associated with the Holocaust where people were mass murdered. And I don't think from what I know of what's happening in China, I don't think that term, it's fair to apply that term. Certainly there is repression of Uyghurs going on in China, but it's also a complicated issue where I think what you're seeing is neocons like John Bolton, who have their own imperial designs, exploiting internal divisions and unrest to pursue their own aims. And then what ends up happening is we end up discussing it in a really, I think, in a way that is not quite reflective of the reality. And the fact is China is dealing with an extremist problem in Xinjiang, and it's cracked down, I think you can say, harshly. But this notion that it's committing genocide to me is hyperbolic. So I think we have to be careful about our language and also about just trusting the recollection of people like John Bolton who want to weaponize issues like this for their own aims. I mean, it's a complicated issue, and I'm not an expert, but I just think I approach it with that baseline.
All right, so there's a lot to get to in that clip. First, Aaron starts off with this war against reality, and he makes this argument that I honestly cannot understand why anybody thinks this is a convincing argument to make. That we cannot call them concentration camps because concentration camps are associated with Nazi Germany. Therefore, literally anytime you bring up concentration camps, whatever you're talking about equals Nazi Germany. But I say this is a war, he waged a war on reality, because the reality is there's a literal dictionary definition for the word concentration camp. And I'll read it to you right now, and I've read it on the show before. A place where a large number of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities. That is a definition of a concentration camp. And I would love for someone to explain to me how that's not exactly what they're doing in China when it comes to these Uyghur Muslims. So the idea that concentration camps is something specific and can only be used in regards to the Jews and Nazis is absurd. It was when the Nazis were doing it, there wasn't even just Jews that they had in concentration camps. But like I said, according to Aaron Maté, that's his logic, and it's so silly. And nobody, when you say that, it's clear you didn't even take a moment to think about how ridiculous that is, or extrapolate that to it, that argument, and apply it to other words that have negative associations with specific horrific events in history. If we're gonna play this game, what if I said, you know what? This country had a horrific history of kidnapping people from Africa, bringing them to this country, torturing them and making them their slaves and doing their work for free. Therefore, I don't think anyone can ever use the word slave because this country had a history of enslavement and they were brutal to black people like myself in this country. Therefore, nobody can ever use the word slaves. So even though it has a literal dictionary definition that applies in many other circumstances outside of that specific context, just because I have an association, an emotional association with that word, you can never use it in the proper context. That's absurd. So nobody can ever use the word wage slave. There are millions and millions of wage slave. Wage slavery in the United States is baked into the cake. That is part of our economy. Wage slavery is a real thing. Are we not allowed to say that because it has the word slavery? And like I said, this country has a horrific history with the word slavery. Or are we not allowed to use the word sex slaves for people who are trafficked against their will across the world and across the country? Are we not allowed to talk about other literal slaves that countries have, like Libya? They have a literal slave market out in the open. After Obama overthrew the government, complete chaos took over the country, and now they're selling slaves in broad daylight. Like I said, are we not allowed to call them slaves? Because here in the United States, we have a horrific history with that word, and I have an emotional association with that word to the specific context of U.S. slavery. Therefore, you can never use it in any other context. That is so stupid. That is so silly. It's so absurd. And it's clear that Aaron Maté just had this thought in his head and he never questioned and say, hey, does this make any sense at all? Let me apply this in other contexts to see if it makes sense. Because if he did, he would not be making this argument. Now, the part that I found to be absolutely insane was when Aaron Maté, quote, this is a harsh response to an extremism problem that they have in China. Now, I'm not going to comment on the inner politics and dynamics of what's going on with some extremist faction of Uyghur Muslims. I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know enough about that dynamic to say whether or not there's an extremism problem from the Uyghurs in China. I'm not even going to touch that. But when you say that these concentration camps are a harsh response to extremism, that makes it seem as if rounding up kidnapping 1 million plus people, women, elderly people, children, innocent people, rounding up 1 million of them indiscriminately, torturing them is in any way an option that is on the table to deal with any level of extremism that any government faces. And when you look at historical context of how governments use the label of extremist and terrorist to justify a crackdown on people they want to discriminate against or their political opponents, it's clear that governments do this all the time. So why would you take it at face value that the government says they have an extremism problem, therefore what they're doing has to be some way, even though it might be harsher than I might do, tougher than I might do if I was in charge, but they have to address the extremism problem, and that's what they're doing. You want to talk about Nazi Germany? They made the same exact argument when they were targeting the Jews. They said the Jews were terrorists and extremists, and they were destabilizing the country, and they were the source of all the problems. Therefore, it is justified to kidnap, round up millions of them, torture them, and later on execute them. Because they have an extremism problem here in the United States. And Aaron Maté is very critical of this war on terror that the United States is waging in the Middle East and across the world. Because it is this amorphous, undefined enemy of terrorists and extremism that the US government says they're targeting. But in reality, how it manifests is an indiscriminate war in the Middle East where we're just setting the place ablaze and we don't even know what the goal is. We don't even know specifically who we're targeting. We use this excuse of going after extremists and going after terrorists to wage this entirely illegal, immoral, unethical genocide in Iraq, which is the war in Iraq. That was the exact reason that we used to justify that. One of the reasons we used to justify that. One of the reasons we used to justify our involvement in Syria, where we're facilitating mass murder and genocide. Justify our involvement in Yemen, where we're literally contributing to the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. A genocide on a scale that we have not seen since the Holocaust. And what's the excuse for that? We're going after extremists. We're going after terrorists. Aaron Maté knows this is horseshit. Aaron Maté knows that this is just a rationalization to do the policies that financially and politically benefit the neocons and the military-industrial complex who profit off of war. So I don't know why he doesn't apply the same skepticism that he would apply to the U.S. government when they justify horrific actions by saying we're going after the extremists, we're going after the bad guys. Why doesn't he apply that same skepticism when it comes to the Chinese government, who's known for their authoritarian crackdowns and disappearing political dissidents in the country? I mean, can you imagine if Donald Trump used that same logic, I don't know, for immigrants? He fearmongers about immigrants all the time. Famously, in his announcement speech that he was running in 2016, the Mexicans, they're rapists, they're murderers, they're criminals. Some of them are good people. And he actively tries to conflate everyone who is an immigrant who comes into this country without paper. He tries to conflate them to violent gangs like MS-13. So he's laid the groundwork for the premise that we need to go after all these immigrants of South American and Latin American descent because they're a threat to the country. So if Trump were to just start rounding up 1 million people, 1 million immigrants from Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, and he just starts rounding them up, putting them in concentration camps or re-education camps, would Aaron Maté have the same flippant, dismissive, oh, well, they say they're going after extremism, so what am I going to say? Would he have that same attitude? I highly doubt that. Or what if Trump started doing that with black people in this country? We already know the FBI has labeled Black Lives Matter as Black identity extremists. So they're already using the same language. Label them extremist, which is a synonym for terrorist. And so if Trump was to decide, oh, you know what? I want to round up black people indiscriminately in this country. Anybody who's related to or has any connection to Black Lives Matter, anybody who supports it, or just if you're black in general. We have an extremism problem. You see how widespread Black Lives Matter is across the country. What if Donald Trump's response is, you know what? To deal with these extremists, let's round up 1 million of them, kidnap 1 million of them, and torture them indefinitely. And that's just how we're going to deal with extremism. Would Aaron Maté say, you know what? That's just a harsh response to an extremist extremism problem that we have in the United States. No, I highly doubt that he would have he'd take the same position. So I'm just confused why he is so willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the Chinese government when all pieces of evidence show that they should not be trusted on this issue. And for more information that just proves the idea that this is a response to a legitimate response to a legitimate extremism problem in China. One, when they started this, and for over a year, they denied this was even happening. So right there, that's a giant red flag. If you're conducting legitimate law enforcement operations, I have never known any government to be targeting terrorists in their country with a specific program or such an expansive operation, and at the same time deny to the public, deny to the press, deny to everyone that you're actually even doing this. That's a giant red flag that maybe you're not conducting legitimate law enforcement operations, but instead what you're doing is indiscriminately violating the human rights of millions of people in your country. Furthermore, did you know before before the roundup even started, in the province of China where the Uyghurs mostly live, the government literally put in government workers to spy on these people in their homes. And it was some weird Orwellian program, and they made it seem like these government workers were just family friends. They were just part of the family, and they were coming to stay and pay a visit and learn about culture and stuff like that. But it was never a voluntary program. The government just forced people to allow monitors to watch them and report on them from inside their homes. And if they were, and then as the camps began to expand and became a thing, those same government spies, whatever you want to call it, who were reporting on these people from inside their homes and reporting on their families and all their activities from inside their homes, at a certain point, they just made it illegal for them to practice their religion. So if they were caught praying or being a part of any type of religious activity, they'd be reported to the government and they would be disappeared and sent to one of these concentration camps to be tortured indefinitely. Again, what part of that sounds like a legitimate law enforcement operation to target extremists in your country? None of that does. What that sounds like is a genocide. What that sounds like is indiscriminately rounding up political dissidents and people who don't agree with you, so you could either brainwash them, torture them into compliance, or just disappear them. Keep them in prison indefinitely, or in some cases, I'm sure they're just killing people too. So this was a bizarre defense of the Chinese government from Aaron Maté. It's entirely indefensible what he did what he said in this clip, and it's crazy that Krystal Ball let that shit skate. She let that shit slide in her interview with absolutely no pushback. And I know that's like, I like the interviews that they do on the Hill a lot of the time, and I've come to understand their interview style. It is not very adversarial, if it's adversarial at all. And they aren't very confrontational with their guests. That's their style. They produce some quality interviews a lot of the times. But at some times, and this is just a disagreement I have, at sometimes what your guest says is so outlandish, it's so out of bounds that you do need to provide some pushback, and you need to correct the record and let it be known that this is not an acceptable position or a position that's in any way reasonable. Because bring it back to Nazi Germany. If Krystal Ball was hosting a show and somebody came out and was a Nazi apologist, talking about gas chambers, what gas chambers? I have no idea what you're talking about. Holocaust? What Holocaust? They had an extremism problem, and they dealt with an extremism problem. I don't know what you're talking about. If anybody came on her show and did that, I'm sure she would have pushed back on that immediately. But in the case of Aaron Maté, I think it's because, and in general with the show, a lot of the people that they have on are their personal friends and people that they interact with professionally all the time, and they don't want any type of hostile relationship, or they don't want to rock the boat in any serious way, so they don't really provide much pushback in their interviews. But this time, I don't care what your normal operating procedures are. This was so out of bounds. She should have checked Aaron Maté on the spot, because there is no defending the Chinese government kidnapping and torturing over 1 million people, women, children, and elderly people, indiscriminately and indefinitely. There's no defense of that. I'm not calling for anybody to be canceled. I'm not saying cancel Aaron Maté. I'm not saying cancel Krystal Ball. But we should definitely point out when people on the left have absurd positions like Aaron Maté had in this interview.